Howdy, and welcome to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. The Preaching Poetry Podcast uses poetry to inspire conversation and to rediscover the world. Let's get to it. Welcome back. Today we're going to be going through the very first stanza of the poem, "And Death Shall Have No Dominion" by Dylan Thomas. And death shall have no dominion. Dead men naked, they shall be one with the man in the wind and the west moon. When their bones are picked clean and the clean bones gone, they shall have stars at elbow and foot. Though they go mad, they shall be sane. Though they sink through the sea, they shall rise again. Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion. Before we start, I want to say a word about this poem and why I chose to do it today. This poem holds a very special place in my heart, near and dear to me. And if you don't actually know me, my grandfather passed away not quite a year ago. In September of 2019, he passed away. And I was asked by him to do his eulogy. He asked me to do the eulogy before he passed. It was a very heavy thing to do. It was a hard thing to do. But it was certainly something that I wanted to do. I wanted to take a moment to honor him. And so when we had the eulogy at his funeral, I read that excerpt of the poem, "And death shall have no dominion." My grandfather was a good man, a kind man, a man who spent most of his life serving other people, committed to his family. He was a paratrooper in the U.S. Army. He was also a Dallas Police Department officer. He retired at the rank of sergeant. He was a good and kind and honorable family man. I love him and I miss him. And so this episode of the Preaching Poetry Podcast is dedicated to him, to my grandfather, Robert Wayne Coker. So let's talk about the poem itself, and let's talk about Dylan Thomas. First, I just want to say that Dylan Thomas's poems are more recent, and they are not in the public domain. So I'm not sure exactly what the legality is of us reproducing his work. I know that we can reproduce excerpts of it under fair use rules, but it's a little bit stickier when you talk about reproducing the entire poem. So it's even more fitting that we just do the one stanza I used in the eulogy. And this is my favorite stanza. Now, the rest of the poem is good, and you should go and read it. But far more than actually going through the poem, I want to talk a little bit about Dylan Thomas, and then I want to talk a little bit about death. So, Dylan Thomas was born in 1914 and died in 1953. He lived a very short life, and he died at 39 years of age. Okay, he is by far the most recent poet that we have done an episode over. Any of his poetry, and even though he lived a short life and his poetry hasn't been around as long as others, he is incredibly influential. He has been a pretty significant influence on poets who are living and writing today, but also on other artists, musicians, songwriters, and Dylan Thomas's poetry is, it's good in its own right, but it has that sort of extra boost of being able to say this poet and his poems inspired other poems and poets, and so that makes this perhaps an even more important poet to discuss. He was a romantic. He liked to use vivid imagery in his poems. He liked to talk about things that were almost supernatural. He liked to illustrate nature in very stark ways. But he also spent a lot of his time writing about melancholy, things that were depressing, sad. Now, I'm sure the drinking didn't help, but Dylan Thomas was a profoundly depressed guy. And, it's no wonder that being as depressed as he was, drinking as much as he did, being in as poor health as he was, it's no surprise that he did not live to a ripe old age. However, he is very famous for quite a few other reasons. You may have heard Dylan Thomas before, and you may have even heard some of his other poems. Now, this poem that we're going to talk about, "And Death Shall Have No Dominion," you may have noticed that the first line and the last line are the same. So you have the beginning starts with, "And death shall have no dominion," and the last line ends saying, "And death shall have no dominion." Okay, and this is clearly the thesis of Dylan Thomas's poem here, and it's the same in the other stanzas. He starts with, "And death shall have no dominion," and ends with, "And death shall have no dominion." Okay, death is not an uncommon topic for poets and poetry. It's definitely not even an uncommon topic for a man like Dylan Thomas. Perhaps you have heard of one of his maybe most famous poems, "Do not go gentle into that good night." Here he says, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." And so that poem is a fiery defiance of death. And this poem is very different in tone. "Do not go gentle" expresses anger at death, rage. He encourages his listeners to rebel against death even in old age, and he asserts that there is no dignity in death except to struggle against it. But this poem, to me, "And Death Shall Have No Dominion," is far more sure-sighted. You see, here, Dylan Thomas is speaking truth to us in a way that allows us to look at mortality without fear, but with hope that cannot be quenched, with hope that cannot be put out by death. A hope that there is a place where death will lose its power over us, because that's what the word dominion means. Dominion is rule and power, the sway that death holds. And this poem holds out hope that death shall have no dominion, that there is coming a day, coming a time, when death shall have no dominion. "Dead men, naked, they shall be one with the man in the wind and the west moon." He says they shall be one because death is a unifying experience. All people stand naked before death. It is no respecter of person, no respecter of wealth, no respecter of power, goodness, wickedness, nothing. Death comes to all of us, and we are all bound to the same fate, and that fate is death. You can't hide from it. You can't disguise yourself from it. Doesn't matter if you die wearing a tuxedo or if you die wearing raggedy sweatpants. All of us stand naked before death. This calls to mind, it's been a little bit since we've talked about Bible references and poems, but in Ecclesiastes, which is a book in the Bible. It's a wisdom book. It's a very sort of melancholy, depressed book that talks about the wisdom of the world and the way that things go. Not always a very hopeful book, but it says this, that one event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, the clean, and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and to him who does not sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath, as he who fears no oath. For man also does not know his time. Like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, so the sons of men are snared in an evil time, when it falls suddenly upon them. And that is death. And yet, Dylan Thomas, says that death shall have no dominion. Going on, he says, when their bones are picked clean and the clean bones gone, they shall have stars at elbow and foot. Now, flesh and bone may be destroyed by malice, or maybe just by the slow grinding of time, the decay of the centuries, right? But this destruction cannot be final because death shall have no dominion. Stars at elbow and foot paint an image of a world to come, and maybe it's Elysium, right? The fields that Ulysses wanted to get to, the blessed isles. He wants to meet Achilles. Maybe it is a paradise. Maybe it's where that famous, the robber, the thief on the cross, that Jesus said, today you'll be with me in paradise. And maybe that's what he's getting at, that there is some hope of heaven after death. I really don't know, because Thomas doesn't really tell us what he thinks about the afterlife here. He's not using this poem to expound upon heaven or hell, but instead he paints a deep picture of spiritual existence, though rooted in reality far above our current reality, a reality where death shall have no dominion. Death may have dominion now. Death may be taking care of us and destroying us and wiping us out now, but there is coming a day, there is coming a reality, there is coming an existence where death will not be the end. He goes on to say that though they go mad, they shall be sane. Though they sink through the sea, they shall rise again. Yeah, you got to say again, because if you're going to say sane, you can't say again, sane again. You got to say sane again. Okay, come on, just get with it. It's British, Welsh, whatever. Anyway, he says that remember that though bad things happen, death shall have no dominion. So sanity will be restored. The sea will give up their dead. Okay, that's another biblical theme. Though they sink through the sea will give up her dead. That's in the book of Revelation at the end of the Bible. But notice what Dylan Thomas doesn't say here. He doesn't say that the hurt isn't real, or that suffering isn't real, or that tragedy isn't real. He acknowledges it. Though they go mad, they shall be sane. Though they sink through the sea, they shall rise again. Dylan Thomas is not trying to talk about this, afterlife existence, this place where death loses its power. He's not using that to minimize and minimalize people's suffering and pain in the now, because people do suffer now. It's important to recognize and realize that. And when we talk about death, we have to remember that pain is real, and that even though death shall have no dominion, suffering and tragedy and hurt are powerful things. And they may be exercising some pretty powerful and dangerous authority in people's lives. If you are going through suffering and hurt and pain and tragedy, it is real, it is powerful, it can be crushing. But what Dylan Thomas is saying is that though those things may be hard in this moment, that they do not have the ultimate authority, because death shall have no dominion. Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion. Lovers may be lost, but love shall not be lost. I don't know about you, but that's a beautiful idea in my head. It sounds beautiful, and it sounds hopeful, and that line right there, it's one of those reasons, right, that this poem was so special and important to me, and so powerful that I would read it at a funeral. That death here is meeting a force with as much power as its own, because though lovers be lost, love shall not. And this gives us a clue as to what might be able to stand up to the dominion of death, and that clue is love. And since we've already talked about the Bible a little bit, let's talk about the end of the Song of Solomon, another famous poem. It says this, it says, "Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is as strong as death, jealousy is cruel as the grave. Its flames are flames of fire, a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, nor can floods drown it. If a man would give for love all the wealth of his house, it would be utterly despised." Love is as strong as death. I think that while Dylan Thomas does not make it explicit what he believes to be the source of this death having no dominion, he's not explicit about it. He does say that love shall not be lost. And that calls to mind the idea that love is as strong as death. At least as strong of death. At least as strong as death. Hopefully it's just a little bit stronger. And death shall have no dominion. Now, Dylan Thomas wrote this poem in response to a friend of his, an amateur poet who worked as a grocer named Bert Trick. And Trick suggested that Dylan Thomas and he write a poem about immortality. Now, he challenged Dylan freaking Thomas to a contest. Okay, it's not hard to guess who won, but here's Trick's poem, okay? Thankfully, we have this preserved for us. So here's Trick's poem. Let's see what you think. And who knows? You may like it. We'll see what happens. But this was what Trick wrote for his part of the contest. We already read, "And death shall have no dominion," Dylan's entry in the contest. Bert Trick wrote this: "For death is not the end, though soul turns sour and faith dry rots. Let maggots feed on flesh that once was blossom pink, and memory sink beneath the dust of failing years. Yet death is not the end, for death is not the end." Now, I don't know about you, but I think Dylan Thomas definitely won that contest. But we know because of this little contest, it's recorded that Dylan Thomas actually based this poem off of St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Okay, more Bible. You might be getting sick of it by now, but hey, it's all over this poem, so we got to talk about it. So, in chapter 6 of the letter to the Romans, Paul writes this: "If we have been united together in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin. For he who has died has been freed from sin. Now if we died with Christ, we believe that we also shall live with him, knowing that Christ, having been raised from the dead, dies no more. Death no longer has dominion over him. And death shall have no dominion." Now, I don't know exactly what Dylan Thomas's views are on the afterlife. I can't know for sure because he's not around for us to talk to. And, perhaps I could go and find a biographer who could give me a picture of some of the things that he would have thought. But it's hard to believe that a man who would write a poem like "Do not go quiet into that good night," a poem saying, death seems to be this final, terrifying end, rage against it, and then a poem like this where he says, "And death shall have no dominion," I would imagine that a man like Dylan Thomas maybe wrestled with what he believed in and wasn't quite sure. And that's a perfectly legitimate place to be in. No matter what you believe now, I think it's important to constantly be questioning and understanding and revising and trying to gather more information, trying to make better sense of what you know to be true in the world. We may not know what Dylan Thomas thought exactly, But there's two other people who I think we need to figure out what they think. And the first one is me, and I'll tell you what I think, but the second one is you, dear listener. And it will be very important for you to figure out what you believe about death and life after it, because it has a lot of bearing on what you do right now. But as for me, I believe that there is life after death. And I chose this poem because I agree with what St. Paul said. Okay, and I echo his words. He wrote in a different letter, in the letter to the Philippians, I believe. He said that, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. I want to share in his sufferings, to conform to his death, so that somehow I might obtain the resurrection from the dead. And that's what I believe. I believe that death is not the end, that death shall have no dominion, that those who die, that those who go mad, they shall be sane again, that though lovers be lost, love will not. I believe that. And I'm not saying that I never wrestle with it. I'm not saying that I don't have my days and I don't have my doubts. But even on those days when I struggle to believe it, oh man, I want it to be true. I want it to be true. I love the idea that I may be able to see my grandfather again. That he will exist where cancer wasn't destroying him, where diabetes wasn't destroying him, where having smoked a lot wasn't destroying him, where he could be made whole again. And that's what I hope for myself too. Now, please don't hear me say this. If you don't agree with me, if you don't believe in resurrection, if you don't believe that Jesus can bring that to you, that's fine. You don't have to agree with that, and you don't have to believe it to listen to this podcast, I hope. However, just in the interest of full disclosure and honesty, I feel like it's important to tell you what I believe. But again, the point of this podcast is not for me to preach what I believe to you. The point of this podcast is to let the poetry tell us what it thinks, and for us to decide what we think. So now, it's incumbent upon you, dear listener. What do you think about these things? Does death have dominion over you? What do you look to in the face of death? Now, one interesting thing, no matter what you believe in about the afterlife, is that I do believe poetry has power in the face of death. That the beautiful ideas of a poem like this one can give us great comfort. They can give us great inspiration. And who knows, maybe one day you will be called upon to deliver a eulogy. I pray that doesn't happen anytime soon. But maybe one day it will fall to you to bring words of comfort and peace to people who are grieving and mourning loss. Dylan Thomas may be dead. Death may have killed him, but his poetry lives on. And so just like the poetry that he wrote can live on in our consciousness, the people that we love and we remember and we cherish live on with us. And death shall have no dominion over them. Thank you guys so much. This is the end of Season 1 of the Preaching Poetry Podcast. It has been a joy and a pleasure to get to do this with you guys. I hope that you liked something that you heard well enough to tell your friends about it. Anyway, spread the word, please, and I will see you guys back in Season 2. Thank you for listening to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. I hope that you enjoyed your time with us, and we look forward to having you back for more. If you like what you heard, please be sure to leave a review, and don't forget to subscribe. If you're looking for more content, you can find us on Apple, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, basically anywhere you find podcasts. If you want to join our community, or just want to get in touch with us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Preaching Poetry.